Hello, I'm your host, Efi Pylarinou, and today I have the pleasure to connect and introduce Dr. Oriol Caudevilla, who is a well-known voice in the fintech area, actually a global voice, as he is an honorary fellow at the Asian Institute of International Financial Law at the University of Hong Kong. He's also a board director at the Global Impact FinTech Forum. He's very well known for his involvement in fintech accelerators in Asia. First of all, welcome, Oriol.
Thank you very much, Efi. It's my pleasure to be here today.
Yeah, when I think of you, I think of someone who has a rare and very impactful combination of background and knowledge and experience, since financial law and technology and your passion in innovation is really important. So I reached out to discuss with you, of course, about the Digital Yuan, as you have recently published research in that area, and you speak a lot about Central Bank Digital Currencies and the innovations in that part. For our audience, I'd like to start with a kind of a back flash to what has happened with the Digital Yuan, as I have recently published an article chronicling the history of the Digital Yuan and the pilots that have been done. And the more recent activity that's interesting to me is the fact that BNP Paribas China launched a Digital Yuan management system for its corporate clients. I see that as pretty significant, and more significant than the flashy, Winter Olympics in Beijing, piloting of the Digital Yuan. And as you know, Oriol, BNP Paribas, because of this new service, they are facing questions from politicians in Washington who want to know what is this project and whether it has political ramifications given the tensions that exist. And on top of that, I think the situation shows that there is an interest, a market interest and a market need for these management systems, because DBS Bank in Singapore also launched a similar offering for institutional clients in China to receive Digital Yuan payments. So for me, Oriol, this is very interesting, and I want to hear your high-level view on this topic, which of course is about fintech, but it's also geopolitics. It's also controversial. It's interesting.
Indeed, I fully agree with you, Efi. I think it's pretty much what you mentioned. This topic is intertwined, with politics or geopolitics, finance. So there's a lot to it, and it becomes kind of difficult sometimes to talk about Digital Yuan without mentioning other aspects. I mean, you said it now, no? I mean, a bank decides to start a new project, and then, well, they need to face questions. That's what's going on. No, we are living in a polarized world. So this is why Digital Yuan per se, even when you want to approach this topic from a neutral position, usually implies or involves certain geopolitics to a certain extent. And well, whereas it is like that, I always try to make my articles and everything as neutral as possible, by trying to analyze the situation and provide a picture, even though, I mean, it's not always possible, of course, but that's what I try to do.
Yeah. I mean, payments have always been core to economic activity, whether, in the old form of cash and notes, checks, whatever, right? Or in this CBDC or other digital form. So obviously economic activities are also political, and policy related and shaped by policies. That there's no doubt about that. I don't think that will ever change, no matter what future we live in, right? Policies are going to determine a lot of the economic activity. Oriol, I want to go back and ask you some basic questions that still remain, I would say, confusing. People don't understand what are the differences and similarities of Alipay and Tencent Pay. That is very well known and understood how that functions. How does that relate to the digital yuan and to the interbanking systems like SIPs of China or SWIFT? And how do these relate with the digital yuan? It would be wonderful if you could spell this out for us once and for all.
No, that's a very interesting question. It's a very interesting one, which we could discuss for hours, no? But to make it brief, I would say that, well, digital yuan is a CBDC, a central bank digital currency, which means, as you all know, it's well, a currency issued by a central bank in a digital form, etc. So that's the digital yuan, also known sometimes as DCP or ECNY or ERMB. So it's all the same, digital yuan. Then we have Alipay, WeChat Pay, which are well, payment companies from China, like huge ones. And at the very beginning, it raised some questions in the sense that some people were wondering inside China and also in the West, what role will digital yuan play? Will digital yuan replace those companies? Because one very important thing for all of us to remember is that China or Chinese people, and I'm talking about mainland China, that's not the case of Hong Kong or other places in Asia, but people in mainland China, they do not use much cash, especially if you go to big cities like, I don't know, if you take a plane and you go to not just Beijing or Shanghai, but even, I don't know, Chengdu, Shenzhen, you will see that it's actually rare to find anyone carrying cash or paying with cash, to the point that you may go to shops, to restaurants, and even if you try to pay with cash, they may not accept cash. And this is so because, well, it's a society that it's not like very reliant on cash, meaning that people use other means of payments and not just credit cards, not just Union Pay, etc., but also Alipay, WeChat Pay. WeChat Pay is what we call a super app, not just WeChat Pay, but WeChat in general. It's a super app. Super apps are very common in China. Super apps are those apps that allow you to do practically like everything. WeChat, as you know, it's like WhatsApp. It's a texting app. Now you can send chats, messages, but you can also like do pretty much everything. You can as well pay using WeChat Pay, or that's the case of Alipay as well. No, so many people use those to pay, and many people were wondering initially, will digital yuan has it been created to replace those apps? And well, initially I know there were those questions, but after a while, China stated, and then they stated that, and by the fact, it's been proven that it was true, that actually a digital yuan didn't come to replace those. Digital yuan will be integrated within those. So you may be wondering, is Alipay or Alipay the only way in which people in the future will be able to use a digital yuan? No, people will also be able to use, for example, their digital banking wallets, to pay using the digital yuan. I mean, there will be several ways, but one of them will be the integration of digital yuan inside Alipay, WeChat Pay. So to answer the first part of your question, Alipay, WeChat Pay are payments companies that provide people as a means to electronically pay for the purchases, and digital yuan will be integrated within or inside those apps. And then you also asked me the difference between digital yuan and SWIFT, for example. Well, I think that's interesting because rather than focusing on the difference, I think we should focus on how or to what extent digital yuan will be able to make certain circumstances change. We all saw, for example, last year, because of the Ukrainian conflict, that SWIFT is a powerful tool, in the sense that if you remove a country from using SWIFT, you are affecting this country's economy for sure. I mean, to what extent, it will depend, but it affects, of course, enormously for a country to be left out of SWIFT.
Of that network, yes.
Exactly, from the network, no, because this network is vital, it's pivotal in most of the world. So digital yuan, it's part of what I wrote in my article in this report that I published at the Blockchain Research Institute called Digital Yuan and Cross-Border Payments. It's part of these trends of de-dollarization that we are experiencing right now. I'm not saying by that that we that no country, will use the US dollar in the future or anything like that, but we are experiencing those trends in which or through which the US dollar is becoming less used. Of course, this needs to be like put into perspective. I'm not saying by that overnight the US dollar will become like obsolete or anything like that. I'm just saying that we are seeing more and more countries willing to use other currencies to settle their transactions, their international trade transactions, than the US dollar. We saw, for example, the Saudi Arabia finance minister in Davos, in Switzerland, in January, saying that they would be open to considering like using other currencies. We saw Brazilian President Lula da Silva in Beijing in April talking about that as well, and many other world leaders are talking about that, especially this year, where we know that the Fed's interest rates have been causing certain instability or concern to other countries. So I would say the digital yuan is part of these dollarization trends, meaning that I'm not saying that it will be like that for sure, but it could be part of a parallel financial system created in parallel to SWIFT or the existing network gateways. I'm not saying that this will be like that because, for example, China signed a joint venture with SWIFT in February 2021 to internationalize the yuan. So I'm not saying that this digital yuan has been created necessarily, to affect SWIFT, etc., in any way, but it can be like this can be one of the results. We can be like seeing a world in the future where perhaps thanks not only to the digital yuan but to other CBDCs as well, perhaps certain sanctions will not be that effective because countries will have like other ways
alternatives.
Exactly, alternatives.
Oriol, what is the relation of China with the SWIFT network? Are Chinese banks part of the SWIFT network, and how does this relate? Have there been projects, POCs with SWIFT for the digital yuan?
Well, as you said before, China has its own network, but still it has an interesting and curious relationship with SWIFT in the sense that it's not like to put it this way, they don't talk to each other because we saw, for example, this interesting joint venture signed in February 2021 between the People's Bank of China and SWIFT to, in theory, use SWIFT to promote the yuan. To be honest, I don't know how that is going right now. I know that this joint venture was signed, so I don't know in practice what it has involved in the end. Probably it hasn't been put into practice yet. My point is that even though China has its own networks, well, it's not like they are not open to collaborate because we saw this joint venture. But of course, talking about banking in China is a tricky topic because the Chinese banking system, you need to think, it's very different from that of many countries in the West. Actually, before even starting, to get involved in the fintech world in 2016, 17, part of my research when I was doing my PhD and work as well, aside from research, was on the Chinese banking system. I focus on shadow banking, but I covered the banking system as a whole. And well, that's probably because, I worked in Hong Kong for a public listed company. Was very, exposed to the banking system. And it's interesting because, well, at least for many years, the Chinese banking system, and even now, it's a system where you need to think that most of the major, actually all the big banks are public banks. They are state-owned, state-controlled. So unlike other countries, this has many implications, because, for example, it implies that it has been very difficult for small and medium enterprises to access the credit. The credit was usually reserved for bigger projects, meaning that this is why a parallel shadow banking system was created. So I know this is not related necessarily to what we are discussing, but the idea is that the Chinese banking system is actually quite different from that in other countries. I know that the basics may be the same, but there are important differences.
But it is very much related, Oriol, because one of the financial inclusion potential of the digital yuan in China is to facilitate more access to credit for small businesses. And this has nothing to do with the cross-border payments, but it has to do with the continuous strategic focus on more financial inclusion through the digitalization of the Chinese economy, correct?
Yes, that's right. I mean, when I said it wasn't that related, it's because, I was thinking more of the picture and thinking about macros and this and that, but this is true what you're saying. I mean, it's very related because even though we are focusing this episode more on talking about, de-dollarization, cross-border payments, SWIFT, it is so that internally, domestically, digital yuan, same as other CBDCs, will help in several areas. And when applied to China, digital yuan will be able to promote financial inclusion, for example. And financial inclusion means as well what you said. It means that in theory, it may help those people, those companies that couldn't get access to credit, to get access to credit. And it also means that digital yuan, according to experts, and this is something I've been defending myself as well in all my articles for 3 years, digital yuan will be able to help reduce the importance of the shadow banking system in China, which I must say is not as important or big as it was a few years ago when I was dealing with this topic more intensely, 2016, 17. China's shadow banking system was huge. It is still big, but I would say maybe it's not that big, but still, it's a concern that keeps appearing and vanishing and then reappearing again in China, the shadow banking. So I think that digital yuan will be, well, an effective tool when it comes to trying to tackle this issue or reducing it as much as possible.
Yeah. The shadow banking that you mentioned back in 2016, does that include the peer-to-peer lending sector that we all know had boomed and busted and so on? Do you include that under the shadow banking umbrella if you want?
Yes, I included both those. I mean, for shadow banking, I included like any kind of credit facilitation activity performed outside the traditional banking system. And when I say outside the traditional banking system, it can be peer-to-peer platforms, as you just said, Efi, or even when the banks themselves, the same banks, offered non-regulated products. This was very common in China as well. There were those famous WMPs, wealth management products, which were products that were offered by the banks themselves, but those were not like properly regulated. So this is why we were talking about shadow banking, even though it was offered by a bank itself. So both peer-to-peer platforms and wealth management products offered by banks were shadow banking. And this sector was huge in China precisely because of how difficult it was for certain SMEs to access credit.
I got you. I understand. So back to this cross-border perspective with the digital yuan that you have a focus. Give us a sense of what is going on in Asia, Southeast Asia, Hong Kong, and all those areas in terms of the digital yuan and the cross-border payments, or what should we be watching? As I say, we get a lot of PR of, oh, there's this big Asia Expo, the digital yuan is piloted, but I want to understand more about the real economy, the activities, and the potential, and what to watch going forward.
No, I mean, that's a great question, and I fully agree with you. It's important to separate the hype from the reality, especially in everything fintech or even tech related, because even though there's a huge potential, in all these areas, whenever you combine CBDCs and then people start talking about cryptos, which are not the same, but still, one thing leads you to the other, and then people start talking about Web3 or the metaverse, and then in the end, the hype is huge, but then you may lose sight of what you're actually talking about. So I think it's important to do what you just asked me to do, to separate like the hype from the reality. Well, the reality is that digital yuan, as we said before, it's a CBDC, a central bank digital currency. It's been launched in China. It's actually been a long process. The research started in 2014. It ended in 2020 the actual research when the pandemic started, pretty much. Then there was like this 2-year testing phase where China tested like the digital yuan domestically, but also for cross-border transactions in Hong Kong. And then it was launched in early 2022 in the Winter Olympic Games that you mentioned before. But still, it's not like a full launch in the sense that people living in mainland China will be able to tell you much more accurately than I can. But the idea is that it's not like available everywhere. To do everything. But it's still there. It's like its use is growing steadily. And for example, it was used to buy securities last year. I think it was in June or July for the first time. And then the People's Bank of China, starting from this last December, started to include the eCNY or digital yuan in circulation as part of the amount of currency circulation or M0, which means that they are starting to count that officially as well. So we are seeing progresses which are fast or slow, depending on how you look at that. I mean, fast compared to the rest of the world, slow if we are looking at that from the angle of someone who wants it to have it like deployed like 100% like now, already. But I think it's going well, steadily. And then aside from China, other countries are exploring CBDCs in Asia. I mean, many others, to the point that, for example, Hong Kong, through the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, which is Hong Kong's de facto central bank, is currently involved in 3 CBDC projects. I mean, the digital yuan for cross-border payments, but also M-Bridge project, which is a very interesting project, which includes the central banks of China, Hong Kong, Thailand, and United Arab Emirates. Then there is the electronic Hong Kong dollar as well. Japan is doing the pilot tests on the digital yen. Korea is testing digital won, even though we don't know whether Japan and Korea will eventually launch it or not. But there are like lots of movements in this area. I think that China had the first mover advantage, if we can call it this way, in the sense that China was not the first country in the world to deploy a CBDC in the modern era. We saw, for example, the Bahamas in the Caribbean and Nigeria coming first. The Bahamas came in September 2020 when they deployed officially the Sand Dollar, then in Ireland and Nigeria. So China was not first, but it was the first major economy in the world doing so, deploying its own CBDC. And I think that encouraged others perhaps to go a bit faster, to start. I'm not saying by that the European Union or the Eurozone wouldn't have done that. I mean, they would. So I'm not saying it's related to China, but I'm sure that many countries, especially in Asia, perhaps sped up their pace a little bit because of China being so advanced. And this brings us a bit to the US. I mean, the US initially didn't want to work much on the US digital dollar, but I think that circumstances made them change a bit their mind. And this is where we access maybe the realm of geopolitics. But going back to your question, I think that digital yuan is going well. It's moving forward steadily. Other countries are exploring their own CBDCs as well. But in Asia, I would say that what China did is interesting because they came much before others.
Yeah, and it's also interesting because they are trading partners with so many countries in the region and globally, and we see how this potential can, impact, if you want, the whole trade relationships and economies in general. Oriol, before closing, I wanted to ask you about what is your outlook overall for CBDCs in Asia, and kind of positive, negative risks. What's on your radar? What kind of KPIs do you watch? As you said, everything is subjective. Are things moving fast? Are they moving slow? Give us a sentiment of what you're watching. Is it Singapore? Is it Hong Kong? Japan? Give us your last sentiment, if you want.
Sure. Well, I think that CBDCs in general are moving fast, like across the globe. I mean, we are seeing how more than 85% of central banks in the world are currently working to some extent on CBDCs. But I think that Asia is probably the continent, the area of the world where I am seeing probably more interest, because there are central banks like the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, which are actually involved in more than one CBDC project, or Singapore as well. So there's a huge interest in CBDCs in Asia, and this is because CBDCs can actually be beneficial in many ways. I mean, we said that they can be beneficial for cross-border payments. We talked about Digital Yuan in that sense, but it can be also beneficial for financial inclusion, to make payments faster, more efficient, more seamless, more transparent. So I think, especially in Asia, no, we will be seeing many more CBDCs coming in the next years. India, for example, is working on digital rupee, and I think that's actually a very interesting use case as well, no, for CBDCs, because we know that India, Pakistan, Bangladesh have a huge unbanked population, people who maybe it's not because in some cases they lack money, but sometimes it's just because they lack access to a physical bank branch. And in that sense, a CBDC can be beneficial, same as virtual banking. So I think we will be seeing many more CBDCs being deployed in Asia. Now, India is working in this payment gateway as well, UPI, you know, so which is not, no, it's not a CBDC, but the idea is that we will be seeing many more CBDC projects, and which will bring us to phase two. Phase one is, first of all, to see which country actually launches a CBDC. We know that China did, but then we don't know whether Japan and Korea will in the end, because they are testing their own CBDCs in, you know, under the assumption that they will not launch it unless they see like a rise in the use of alternative electronic means of payments, meaning that perhaps there is no digital yen in the near future. I don't know, but still, in general, we will see many more wholesale and retail CBDCs in Asia. And secondly, in a few years from now, we'll be facing this situation where interoperability will become key, interoperability between different CBDCs, for example. And this is why there are already some projects working on that. For example, in Davos, in I think it was in March, no, sorry, in January as well, yes. This UDPN network was announced. Many different countries have worked in UDPN, including China's BSN. UDPN is going to be like, well, according to themselves.
What does UBPN stand for? It's
Universal Digital Payments Network.
Okay.
And UDPN is a massive project which involves companies from the West, from China, from many different places, which aims to be, according to themselves as well. No, I mean, this is not something I'm saying only. Like for CBDCs.
Yeah, it isn't it interesting? I mean, last year, towards the end of the year, you know, when we are all thinking, oh, what happened, and projections for this year, one of my main highlights was that I'm excited about innovations at the infrastructure level, and CBDCs are one sort of approach, but not the only one. You know, the UPI, which is a very unique public infrastructure innovation that, of course, has had the impact because of public-private partnerships, because as we all know, and you mentioned too, you know, if you don't manage adoption, the last mile, and if you don't manage interoperability, then the impact of all these infrastructures will be limited, right? I mean, technologically or even from the economic activity. So I feel that this is a very exciting phase. What do you think? Are we talking 5 years, a phase of innovation at the infrastructure level across borders? Do you think that in 5 years we will see some meaningful, sizable impact coming from the East and not only China? Or do you think it's more 10 years?
No, I think so. I think 5 years is feasible. For example, when I was interviewing Ifan He for my podcast, Ifan is the CEO of the company behind China's BSN called Red Day Technology in China. He told me that this UDPN network, and I'm saying this because BSN is part of UDPN, this UDPN network was actually like 3 to 5 years ahead of its time, because these interoperability issues will arise maybe in 5 years, but they want to be prepared for that. So I think that, I mean, it's hard to say, but given how fast things are moving, like in this digital realm, especially after the pandemic, I would say that it's feasible to think that in 5 years, we will be like seeing what you said, no, seeing these changes, these infrastructures being created and operational. I think that it's feasible to talk about 5 years. I mean, of course, I may be wrong, who knows, but right now I would say it's feasible.
Yeah, but it's not a science fiction, that is for sure.
Exactly.
I'd like to thank you very much for your time, for your insights. This topic is very not only interesting, but very important. We are talking a whole region that is growing in many ways, whether it's the GDP, the economies. We're talking about demographics, impact, geopolitics. It's a very complex world that we live in, and we can't look at these innovations in isolation. So it's important that people like you share their perspective, and we sort of curate different perspectives to understand what the future holds. I'm very excited, and thank you very much for sharing your insights.
No, thank you very much, Efi, for allowing me for inviting me here. It's an absolute pleasure and honor to be in your podcast, sharing these thoughts about these current and interesting topics.
And for our audience, the best way to follow you is on LinkedIn?
Yes, you can follow me on LinkedIn, where I post like almost daily content. And then I also have this YouTube channel. It's my name, Oriol Caudevilla, where I have my podcast, where I interview relevant people from the area. And of course, feel free to reach out to me if you want to clarify anything or have any doubts, and follow me as well.
Thank you very much, Oriol.
Thank you.